Hello everybody, my name is Andrew and welcome to a special Zero Camp video about the January 2025 rules update for War Machine. This is going to be part 5 where we talk about Winter Korps. Alright, so welcome again to part 5, our Winter Korps update here. So we're going to go ahead and get started by talking about the spell rack for Winter Korps. First thing off the bat, we're going to see a change to superiority. Superiority, the change is realistically that it can just no longer target huge base models. So extra large or smaller, which means super heavy warjacks and below, but no longer can you target the Mastodon. We'll talk about more with this when I kind of share my thoughts for the whole overview, but I think this was a good change for the game. So Arcanist lost the Arcane Reinforcement ability and picked up Sigil of Power. Realistically, this was a positive change. The Arcane Reinforcement was magical weapons for a warjack. Sigil of Power is magical weapons for anybody. So now they're not just there to only buff warjacks. They have Empower, they still have Razorwind, and now they can hand out magic weapons to anybody. That's important because we have changes with Saverin that we'll talk about when we get to him. The battle mechanic goes up from ARM 15 to 16 and then gains the tune-up ability, which allows a friendly faction warjack to stand up, is no longer stationary, continuous effects expire on it, and then it gains Pathfinder for one turn, which is just a slew of a bunch of nice stuff. It gives the mechanic a role besides just walking behind a jack and repairing it now, and the bump in ARM makes him a little more survivable, which is good because ARM 15 was kind of rough for him anyway. So the Direwolf, we see 3 changes really here to the Direwolf. Essentially 3 of its arm options change. There's a right arm option, the Ice Hammer, that goes from cost 4 to cost 5. Otherwise it has no change. You've got a left arm option in the Scrap Saw. It goes from cost 3 to cost 5. But it goes from POW 15 to POW 17, and it still has Crit Shred, which is fantastic. And then another right arm option, the Long Axe, just picks up the Crit Grievous Wounds trait with no cost increase. Now, the one thing that's significant here that it doesn't show inside the block of text is that the cheapest Direwolf is no longer 9 points, it is now 10. Great Bears. So Great Bears also had changes to a few things. The reposition head goes from Repo 2 to Repo 3. This is a speed 4 jack. It now almost repositions as far as it walks, which is kind of insane. Otherwise, the heavy cannon option for the Great Bear, and we'll see this again with the Mastodon when we get to the Mastodon, the heavy cannons just go from range 15 to range 12. Probably a good change for the game overall. As someone who has played quite a bit of Winter Korps, range 15 is a little egregious. And I'll talk about it a little bit more too later. But now that the ranged like the penalty to range debuff stacking is less egregious, having 3 less range on this is not that big of a deal. Then there's also a change to the right arm here, the Deep Freezer. It goes from cost 7 to 8, but it also goes from range 12 to range 14 and grants resistance cold to the Great Bear. That resistance cold is nice because it means the Great Bear is no longer freezing itself when it runs into combat, shoots, and crits the other guy. It doesn't stationary itself, it just crits the things near it, which is hilarious. Also, range 14 on the Deep Freezer. Yes, please. This, oh boy, along with some other changes, is going to be a lot of fun to play. All right, so ECAT, everyone's favorite Winter Korps caster. So she gains resistance cold, which is just kind of a net buff. She does change her feat a little bit. Storm of Ages, it goes from a -4 range on arcane and range attacks targeting models in her control to just a -2. This is kind of just a general theme that we've had throughout the entire rest of the rules update. The range debuffs are just less stackable and less severe for the most part. This follows that pattern. I think that in a way this also takes ECAT down from 11 to a 10, where her time stop feat is less time stoppy. There's still room to play into it. It also means that other casters are going to be more in the running. It's not going to be just ECAT and pick another caster in the Winter Korps selection when we're building pairs for lists now. I think it's going to add more variety to the faction. Speaking of which, we're going to talk about Borzyuk. Oh boy, this guy. All three changes that we see listed here are kind of bananas. So first, he just picks up the arcane precision rule. So now, if he forfeits his movement to aim, he ignores stealth and clouds for line of sight purposes during his activation. It's important to note that it's during his activation because Alari has a lot of out of activation attack potential between his feet and Avenging Force, but that still adds a lot of flexibility on a guy that just has Flare as a shot type to remove stealth from other models. He does swap the Unnatural Darkness spell that he had for Veil of Mist. Unnatural Darkness placed a cloud centered on a model. Veil of Mist places a cloud anywhere and has the added benefit of inside that cloud, you see through it with friendly models, and friendly models gain Pathfinder when moving through it and can move through obstacles and obstructions and other models that they have enough movement to move through them. Veil of Mist is a great spell. It's kind of a Crick staple. It's shown up in quite a few other places throughout the game's history, but it's a nice one to have all of a sudden on Borussia. Also, we have a feat change. Oh boy, his feat. So his feat used to provide a boosted attack roll for the extra attack that was granted by Howl of the Wolf. Now, however, all ranged attacks made inside of his control range during the feat are boosted, whether or not they are the Howl of the Wolf attacks. And then the extra attacks granted by Howl of the Wolf can still be a melee or a ranged option, but the ranged options are just boosted. So Tatiana got a really interesting change here. She kind of swapped her at and her arcs a little bit, the two stats there. She goes from at 7 to 6, but goes up in arc from 6 to 7. So she's less likely to hit with any offensive spells, which there's not a lot of that she wants to do anyway, but she has another focus to play around with, which is super great because that potentially means just 4 positive charges a turn with Lucky Penny. It's kind of silly. Then we've got Savrin. So I mentioned him a little bit earlier just because with Arcanist, they now have sigil power to grant magic weapons. That matters here. Savrin's feat more or less stayed the same, except that it no longer grants damage-type magic to everybody and Blessed. So, if you want magic weapons, you now have to rely on the Arcanist to do it. It's quite corner case. There's not an insignificant amount of incorporeal in the game, especially with the introduction of Cricks and their cavalry models. It's just not as prevalent as it was, say, in Mark III, but it's good to know that there's still that option there, even though it's no longer in the feat. So the controller from the Annihilator's cadre got some fun tech. Goes from Rat 5 to Rat 6, which is nice given the range 10 freeze spray that they have. But what really makes them now more flexible is they have Jack Marshall and Drive Shatter. So Drive Shatter, as you're going to see here just in the text, is kind of bananas. Within 10 inches of the model, if the board jack gains Shatter, an additional die against damaged models that are stationary. Well, guess who has a gun that does stationary? That's right, the Great Bear. Also the controller, and there's also a spell on rack that freezes. It just costs 4. You have so many ways to proc this to just have a jack go absolutely nuts. And considering the prevalence of Arcanists, where you can just buff up a jack that's not powering up in the turn, these Jack Marshall jacks can just go absolutely ham as long as the enemy doesn't have resistance cold to it be not stationary. The Man of War Wrecking Crew from the Annihilator's cadre. Their Battle Saw just gains the Grievous Wounds. So one of their 2 melee attacks is now just a straight Grievous Wounds weapon, which is fantastic. Again, we lost the Savagery card, so this is a good pickup for it elsewhere in the faction. So the Mastodon is something that probably is on a lot of folks' mind, considering what I talked about at the beginning of this, where superiority is not something you can target the Mastodon with anymore. It does go from speed 4 to speed 5, which is a nice change of pace. It does mean that you're not going to have a crazy fast Mastodon. An Escort still works on it, which is silly. But otherwise, it's not going to be really egregious. It's not going to be a speed 8 model running around. It's not. It's just going to be potentially a 7. The heavy cannon on it, just like the Great Bears, goes from range 15 to range 12. And just like the Great Bear, the Deep Freezer changes as well. It goes from range 12 to 14. It gives resistance cold to the Mastodon, although that one matters a lot less. Because it couldn't be stationary anyway. But the important part here for the Mastodon is that it goes from a cost 5 to a cost 6, which now means instead of 29-point Mastodon, the cheapest you can run is 31 points because both the shoulder options are the same cost. So Medveditsa goes from point cost 17 to 15. excellent, with no real changes in rules except that we move the Hand of Vengeance rule from the head to the chassis, which means you cannot lose that ability until she's dead. Absolutely great. 10 out of 10. Play more Vegeta. Mortar teams. This has been one that I have been weirdly stuck on for a long time as someone who's playing Winter Corps. I thought mortar teams were fantastic to begin with, especially after the 2024 rules update when they got a bump up to their rat. But they just went from cost 3 to cost 2. They are cheaper. These guys are dirt. And they are so good. Oh my gosh. Are you kidding me? Range 14 AoE with Arcing Fire? Please and thank you, especially with the blast damage. No one is safe from the terror of my 2-point mortar teams now. Shock Trooper Gunners go from Arm 15 to Arm 16, which is just super nice. And the Shock Trooper Pikemen go from Arm 16 to Arm 17, which is super nice. They still retain Shield Wall, they still have all the other stuff, but it's nice to see both units of the Shock Troopers kind of getting just the bump in armor. Technically, the battle mechanic is also a Shock Trooper as well, so we saw his bump in armor. But it's nice for both of these units because they needed to be just a smidge more survivable. I still have problems personally with the Pikemen, with how I want to play Winter Corps, but I think that extra 1 point of armor is actually going to be a big deal for those who do want to play them. We're probably going to see more of them on the table now. The Winter Corps Infantry got, as it turns out, a pretty significant rework with this update with just these 2 lines of text. It's kind of crazy. The first thing is they cut Lone Gunmen from the autocannon and gave them combined ranged attack, which means that they can participate in those combined ranged attacks. The autocannon is no longer D3+1. It is just D3 for the rate of fire. But I could do a whole other video, something that I talked through someone about in our meta, as far as how that breakdown works, where you just put one of these bad boys in a unit of Winter Corps Infantry now, and regardless of how many shots you roll, you just deal out some nasty damage. That being said, also the rocket launcher becomes better for the Winter Corps Infantry. The rocket launcher for them also gets better. They go from range 8 to range 10. They replace the Jack Hunter ability with brutal damage, so just on a direct hit, they gain extra damage die against models. There's no more AoE, but you have access to so many other AoEs in faction. I don't think that's big of a deal. And it's just nice now to get extra damage output from those guys that you're already inside the units of Winter Corps Infantry. The Winter Corps Officer, with 2 lines of text, also seems like it's getting an insignificant rework, but it's actually getting a lot. It goes from point cost 2 to 3, which, to be fair, never should have been 2 points. Winter Corps Officers have always been insane. They should have been 3-point models. They do lose some things. They lose the Feign Death ability, which means they no longer are just not targetable when they're knocked down by ranged and magic attacks, which is probably a good thing. Their Saber does go from POW 9 to POW 11, which means they get more melee output. And then this is an interesting choice, but they swapped the Stand Your Ground ability with Combat Coordination as part of their battle orders. Stand Your Ground gave set defense, so -2 to charge attack rolls against the models you targeted. Combat Coordination lets a target friendly faction warrior model re-roll 1 attack or damage roll during its activation. Yikes. It is specific to warrior model, so you can't target warjacks with it, but you can target solos with it. It is friendly faction warrior, so you can't pick up Kruger or anything like that, but Bellari, Saverin, Ekaterina, all choice targets. My mortar teams, I'm sorry, what? Bisons are also warrior models. They're not battle engines, so remember that. So they've got some fun tech going for them. And that concludes all of the changes for the Winter Corps. Winter Corps had the most changes to it, so this is probably going to be just a little bit our longest video. I'll also mention here as well that they get the 1 special command card, the For the Motherland, that grants tough to a friendly faction warrior model/unit. So they have that 11th command card that no one else has at the moment, in addition to the other 10. But the changes to Winter Corps were more about, I think, solidifying faction identity. We bumped up some armor on some shock troopers. The Winter Corps Infantry got better. In a lot of ways, I think that makes them very playable. They have placed in a lot of lists all of a sudden that they did not have places in before. The Winter Corps Officer, again, also his role gets a little bit more solidified as a support piece rather than an offensive piece that just does not die and is dirt cheap. the Mastodon and the Great Bear and the Dire Wolf all also saw some changes that brought them kind of into line with, we don't need to just shoot everyone to death. We don't need just a bunch of 9-point Dire Wolves running around. You actually have to make choices now between what Dire Wolf you want to take and what Great Bear you want to take, because they're going to be a little bit more similarly costed. And then you don't have the egregious Mastodon, which again was just running rampant in faction identity. And while it may feel like Saverin and Ekaterina's feats lost some of their teeth, I think it brings them more in line with the other casters. Although the SKS caster we can have a whole conversation about in another video. I think we're going to see more variety for casters played inside of Winter Corps. We're going to see Borsiuk a lot, I think, this upcoming year. His feat is way more disgusting than it was, and I already thought it was pretty good. But I do think that overall, the faction just got a little bit stronger. It's going to have a little bit more presence on the tabletop, and I think it's going to be a bigger contender now and things moving forward. That being said, thank you all for watching. That concludes this part, Winter Corps, Part 5, in our video series about the January 2025 updates. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to like, subscribe, follow, anything like that. We're on a road this year to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, so that way YouTube has to pay us. So thank you all for watching. Hopefully we'll catch you here on our next video. We've still got more armies to cover, or on our next stream. We'll see you then.